Okay, so we're looking at BTEC Level 3 National Extended Diploma in Business. We're looking at Unit 1, Learning Aim D, and we're looking at D2 today. So we're looking at the relationship between demand, supply and price. And in this lesson we'll only be looking at the influences on demand. Okay, so we'll be looking at affordability, competition, availability of substitutes, level of GDP, gross domestic product, and needs and aspirations of consumers, and how these affect demand. So looking at Learning Game D, we should be able to complete P6, M4 and D3. And right now we're focusing on P6. So explore how the market structure and influences on supply and demand affect the pricing and output decisions for a given business. So the first thing I want to go over is demand. So the definition: demand is the quantity of a good or service that consumers are willing and able to buy at a given price in a given time period. Okay, so it's how much consumers or customers are willing to buy, or how much of a product they're willing to purchase, and how much they're prepared to pay for that product. Okay, that's all demand is. All right, it's how much consumers or customers demand. Now, I've got here a demand curve. I've got a demand curve here. So this is a demand curve. It is downward sloping because as price for a product is lowered, demand for that product increases. And you can see on the y-axis we have price in pounds or pence, or whatever currency you're looking at pricing, and on the x-axis we've got the quantity demanded of the good, okay, or service. So this is the actual demand curve, and it's downward sloping because, again, as price is lowered, as price comes down, quantity demanded increases. And this is something logical. Okay, if the price of a product or service decreases, people are going to demand more of it, aren't they? Okay, take for example a burger meal at a shop, for instance. If that burger meal, if the price of the burger meal decreases, the business should see more people come into the shop to purchase that burger meal. If the price of a bike decreases, again, the bike shop owner should see an increase in demand for bikes. They should sell more bikes. Okay, so that's pretty much that. And the same can be said if price increases, demand will contract. Okay, which means demand will shrink or demand will lower. Again, it's logic, isn't it? If something is really expensive, generally speaking, if something is really expensive, demand for that product, good or service, should decrease. Alright? Talking about normal goods here, just the average product or service. I've got a little bit more of a visual example for you. So at P1, at this price here, at P1, Q1 is demanded. Okay, so at P1, Q1 is demanded. So at price of P1, Q1 is demanded by consumers. If we look at number 2, it says when the price is reduced from P1 to P2, so the price of the product or service, whatever it is, it's decreased now from P1 to P2. Okay, price has fallen to P2. Customers now demand Q2. Okay, so you can see as price is decreased from P1 to P2, the amount demanded by consumers has increased from Q1 to Q2. Okay. Now I've got a question here. How much did quantity increase by when the price of Fanta cans were reduced from 80 pence to 50 pence? Okay, how much did the quantity increase by when the price of Fanta cans were reduced from 80 pence to 50 pence? Okay, you can pause it, have a look at the this slide. Okay, now what I'm going to say is that price reduced from 80 pence to 50 pence. So there was a 30 pence reduction in price, which led to a 3,000 increase in demand. Okay, from 2,000 to 5,000. So the quantity demanded cans of Fanta increased from 2,000 to 5,000. So at 80 pence this shop was selling 2,000 cans of Fanta, and when they reduced their prices to 50 pence, so the price of Fanta was now 50 pence, they were selling 5,000 cans of Fanta. Okay, so the quantity demanded of Fanta increased. Okay, so it's increased by 3,000. And that's just explaining it again. Now, a direct change in price leads to a movement along the demand curve. Okay, so if price decreases, that means there is an expansion in demand. And if price increases, that means there is a contraction in demand. Okay, demand has fallen, there is a contraction. Alright, and again, when prices decreased, there's an expansion in demand. Demand has increased. Okay. Now, the demand curve can also shift left and right, and this can be due to people's affordability. Okay, customers and consumers' affordability, their income levels. Okay, how much they can afford, how much they're getting paid. It can be due to competition. If a competitor enters the market or changes their price. It can be due to substitutes. So, is there a substitute good? Is there a good we can replace our current good with? Okay. It could be due to GDP, so gross domestic product. And these levels, whether GDP is high or whether GDP is low. It could also be due to needs and aspirations of consumers. Okay, so whether a product is a need, whether a service is a need, and what consumers' views are of that product or expectations. Now these influences of demand can shift the demand curve to the right or shift it to the left, depending on whether these have increased or decreased, or depending on whether it's a need or not. And now if the demand curve shifts to the right, that means that more is demanded at every price level. Okay, that means more is demanded at every price level, so it's an increase in demand basically. And if demand shifts to the left, that means less is demanded at each and every price level, so that basically means it's a decrease in demand. Now we have a little activity here. You need to try to explain whether demand will shift left or right in the below scenarios. So what will happen to the demand of cars if, number one, people's incomes increase. Number two, if gross domestic product is high. And if you don't know, GDP is the amount of buying and selling which takes place in an economy, to put it short. It is a measure of economic growth or how well an economy is performing. Okay, so if the amount of buying and selling is high, how will that affect the demand of cars? If economic growth is high, how will that affect the demand of cars? Number three, if a competitor selling a different brand of cars enters the market, how would that affect the demand of cars? Number four, if the price of a substitute good, so buses, taxis, trains, like a substitute for cars, if the price of that decreases, how will that affect the demand of cars? And number five, if cars become a necessity, how will that affect the demand of cars? Alright, so you need to just explain whether demand will shift to the left or to the right, and whether demand will increase or decrease at each and every price level. Okay, so you can pause the video here, have a think about that, try and answer the questions. Okay, you should have had a go at that. I'm now going to go to the next slide, which will reveal the answers. Okay, so if people's incomes increase, demand of cars will increase as well. Okay, there should be a rightward shift. If people have more money, more income, they have higher salaries, higher wages, they should be able to afford car travel, private travel. Okay, they should make that switch generally from using public transport to using private transport. If GDP is high, so if the amount of buying and selling or economic growth is high in an economy, demand of cars should increase. Okay, if there's economic growth, people are better off. They have more income again. Demand of cars should increase. Okay, it should shift to the right. If a competitor is selling a different brand of cars into the market, demand for your brand of cars should decrease. It should shift to the left. Okay, the demand curve should shift to the left. This is because now you're up against competition. So customers aren't just going to your shop or buying cars from you. They've now got options. Okay, so some of your customers are going to this different car showroom and buying cars from them. Maybe they've got cheaper cars there, or maybe they've got better quality cars. Okay, who knows? But the demand of your cars will decrease. If the price of a substitute good, for instance bus tickets, taxi fares, train tickets, decreases, then demand for cars should decrease as well. Okay, because if the price of taking the bus to work, for instance, or school or college decreases, then people shouldn't want to take cars because cars become more expensive. Okay, if train tickets decrease, people will start to think about making that switch from using their private personal cars to using trains. And if cars become a necessity, if for whatever reason cars become a necessity, for instance the pandemic has led to some businesses telling their workers to work from home, but in some circumstances where these workers have to still go into work, they're advising them to take their cars and their private transport so they don't mix in buses and on trains. So if cars become a necessity, demand for cars should increase. Again, there should be a rightward shift in demand. Now, we've got influences on demand then, so that was just a quick activity, but we've got the influences on demand here explained. Okay, so the first one is affordability or income. If people's incomes increase, then they can afford to buy more products. This increases demand for all products. Therefore, this should lead to a rightward shift in the demand curve. And if people's incomes decrease, then the opposite is true and demand should fall, thus leading to a leftward shift in the demand curve. Now, gross domestic product, again we said that this was the amount of buying and selling which takes place in an economy, again to put it short, and it is a measure of economic growth or how well an economy is performing. So if GDP is high, then the demand curve should shift right as more people demand your goods and services. Okay. If GDP is low, then the demand curve should shift. Left as less people demand your goods and services. Okay, that should say left. That's a little typo in the PowerPoint which I will correct. That should say left. Okay. Influences on demand. So we've got competition. If a competitor enters the market, more people will flock towards them, thus leaving your business. Therefore, this should lead to a leftward shift in demand curve for your product or service that you're offering. And if a competitor leaves the market, then the opposite will happen, causing a rightward shift in the demand curve. Substitutes. Now, remember, a substitute is something which can replace a product or service. So when we were looking at the example of cars, substitute goods of cars were buses, trains, and taxis. Okay, so a lot of products or services have substitute goods. Okay, you could say that mayonnaise is a substitute for ketchup. You could say that. So, if the price of a substitute good increases, this means customers will switch to your product or service. Okay, thus leading to a rightward shift in demand. If the price of a substitute good decreases, then again the opposite is true, leading to a leftward shift in demand. Okay, if the product or service becomes a need, there should be a rightward shift in the demand curve for that product or service. An example is Wi-Fi. Okay, and due to COVID, Wi-Fi has become a need. Students, teachers working from home need Wi-Fi to operate successfully. Now your task is to define what is meant by demand. You then need to create and draw a demand curve and explain it, and try to apply it to your business where possible. Okay, where possible. And explain the shifts in the demand curve as well, and the contraction and expansions. And in number 3, explain the different types of influences of demand, so the ones that we just went over, but you must apply it to your selected business. Okay, you must apply it to your business, and also where possible, try to use real life examples